Well, hello, everybody, and a very big welcome to our GovernWith webinar today. The webinar today is all about from recruitment to retirement, the director life cycle. And a big welcome to all of you. We have people coming from all around Australia today, which is very exciting, and we are really looking forward to our session with you today. We are so lucky today. Megan Motto, Chief Executive Officer or Chief Executive of Governance Institute of Australia, is with us today. Hello, Megan.
Hello, Fee. Lovely to be here with you.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. And thank you so much for being our guest presenter today. I can't wait to get lots of insight from you about this fantastic topic around the director life cycle. And actually, everybody, before you all came in, Megan and I were just talking about, we actually met when Megan first started in 2019. Gosh, that time has flown, hasn't it?
Yeah, pre-COVID. It feels like 5 minutes ago and 10 years ago all at once.
I know exactly. So before I talk about GovernWith, I'd just love to do a little welcome. I'm actually coming from you all today from the Wadawurrung country. So that's in Bowen Heads in Victoria. And I just want to make a welcome to country to all the elders, past and present, and a very big welcome to all of you from all of the countries that you're in today. A little bit about GovernWith and who it is that's bringing you this webinar today. At GovernWith, we basically help you build high-functioning boards. And over the last 4 years, well, actually, it's longer than that. Megan, would you believe next year we are 10 years old?
Wow.
Isn't that incredible? Absolutely fantastic. Over the last probably 4 or 5 years, though, we've been working with the programs that we've been working with, and well over 600 boards, 6,000 plus directors now have contributed to the extraordinary data that we have the privilege of getting to work with. We work in many sectors, as you can see, and we are very privileged with our partners. And of course, we're incredibly proud to partner with the Governance Institute, because we can't build high-functioning boards without that development piece. And we're really proud to partner with Governance Institute Australia for that development piece. We like to think that wherever we are, we do have an impact in what we do. And this little map just represents that we work with boards all around Australia. And we still think, Megan, that we're small enough to really care, but big enough to make a difference. So let's get on with the conversation that we're going to talk about today. And we are going to talk about the director life cycle. And what we've identified from our data and all of the boards that we work with, Megan, so not only do the boards we work with review their corporate and sector-specific governance responsibilities, they also look at themselves as individual directors and do their skills matrix. And from that data, we've learnt about these crucial steps in a director's life cycle. So there's planning, recruitment, induction, development, mentorship, and retirement. So it's going to be my privilege to work and talk with you today about each of those steps. And I can't wait to hear your insights and your thoughts about those steps and how we can help people. So let's start with planning. And actually, everybody, it was Megan that sort of brought this to our attention. We actually originally thought it all started with recruitment. But Megan, you very wisely said, actually, it starts with planning. So talk to me about that key step.
So, and first of all, thanks again for having me here today. And I'd like to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in the inner west in Sydney, and it's a beautiful, shining day. And I thank the mob of the inner west for their custodianship of the land and water in this area. It's absolutely beautiful country. So, so we talked about the planning process, and I really do believe that this is probably one of the steps, unfortunately, that does get missed because we too tend to jump straight to recruitment. And I wanted to talk a little bit from both perspectives. So there's the planning that an individual goes through when they're thinking about perhaps transitioning onto a board or an NED career, And then there's, of course, the planning that a board has to do when they're thinking about developing, they have an opening for a new director. So from an individual's point of view, that planning process is really important, because unfortunately I've seen far too often people who get to the latter stage of their career and then think, I'd like to give back, I'd like to still participate, and a board position seems like the right thing to do, but they haven't done any of the planning, and it doesn't happen in 5 minutes. You have to build a network. You have to have an idea of what types of boards that you'd be suited for to start developing your skill set, knowledge and experience in that area, to be networking with the right people, to be thinking about how to go about all of that. So it really is something that you need to be thinking 2 or 3 years ahead, not even 6 months ahead, because it can be quite a long process. From the board's perspective, of course, the other side is true. Boards should be thinking about, well, we've got a director position opening, either because we've got a retirement on the board or we're going to create a new board position. What is it that we're looking for? What skills, what behaviours, what networks are we looking for that person to bring to us? What sort of experiences, what sort of talent? And particularly to think about it through the lens of the strategy of the business, because far too often we jump to, what is great practice, but it's a skills matrix. And that just is a cookie cutter approach. And you really need to be thinking of it through, yes, you need the breadth of skills that are normally needed for boards. So you need your financial skills, your legal skills, your IT skills, particularly these days. HR, if you ask most directors what's keeping them up at night, it's actually not understanding the finances and the legal. It's the people side of the business, generally speaking, and a lot about cyber today. So thinking about those skills, sure, but it's also thinking about, well, what type of board are we now? Are we more of a managerial board and we're becoming more sophisticated, so we need to start elevating to be more of a governing board? What type of person would satisfy that sort of need on our board in terms of how we interact, the experience that we have? And it's all of those sorts of questions. It might be that your business is going to go through a massive transformation or a disruption, so you need someone that's adept at that disruption and that transformation innovation agenda. So you're really looking at not only the skill sets to flesh out your general board matrix, but you're thinking about it from a strategic point of view and what you might need. So they're really important parts of the planning process. And unfortunately, if we jump straight to recruitment before knowing what type of person that we want to know, that we need, then you're sort of doomed to failure a little bit from the get-go, I feel, or at the very least, it's going to be a more clunky process than you'd otherwise have envisioned.
I think that's so wise. I 100% agree with you. And it's sort of like anything you do, like strategic planning or anything. If you don't plan, you actually plan to fail. And
if you don't know where you want to go to, then any road will get you there, as they say.
Exactly. So on your planning, and let's talk about recruitment. This is a big one. This is sort of got a lot of traditional mistakes in it as well, hasn't it, Megan?
Oh, it certainly. And look, we have come a long way. I think that the whole process of directed recruitment now is, by and large, far more professional, and yet it's not. It's still very dependent on a network, and that has, for many decades traditionally been a bit of a boys' club. Thankfully, we're starting to even that balance out a little bit, albeit that we've still got, generally speaking, a long way to go. And also thinking beyond the traditional network. And we need to be thinking about more diversity in the boardroom. And that's not just a gender diversity piece. It's around, particularly people from different nationalities, people with different skill sets, different tenures, different outlooks. So thankfully the process is becoming more professional, and it's not just 10 people sitting around going, who do we know in our network, which perpetuates more of the same, and you need that fresh thinking and that diverse perspective. So I always say it's astounding to me that we spent more time and process on recruiting the receptionist than we have at times to recruit a new director who's got a significant impact on the tone, culture and strategy of the organisation. Mm-hmm. And that piece is really important. So increasingly people are looking to professional recruitment firms. I think that process is extraordinarily useful, not just because they're reaching into a vast network themselves, but also because they can help you really think up that scope. What is it that you're looking for? Have you considered other things? And they'll test your thinking. And I think that's a really useful thing to bring that rigor and approach.
No, I think that I couldn't agree with you more. And And I love that notion of being more professional. And that comes back to the planning a bit too, that even if you can't manage to a recruitment firm, being more professional is about that planning as well. I think that's really important.
Indeed.
So we've done the big recruitment, and that I agree that with a bit of planning and being more professional. And then this to me seems to be the one area that directors continually tell us we don't do well. And this is the induction piece. And Megan, of course, as you know, with our assessment processes, we ask this question as a director: how was your induction? Did it help you understand the organisation? Was it based on your skills and your gaps, but also what you bring to the board? And did it actually help you bring those things quicker to the board? And 44% say no. That's huge. So tell us about some of your insights for induction and what you've learned.
Yeah, so look, that number is, that 44% is frightening, but unfortunately not really surprising to me. It is an area where I think a lot of boards don't spend enough time. And I'd say from the other side as well, I think that new directors going onto a board don't necessarily spend a lot of time, or at least enough time really understanding what they're getting themselves into. And I might just go back for a moment, because the biggest question, and I went through this with a recruiter when I was doing some work around recruitment and retention of staff. And this person says to us as an executive team, so when does the induction process start? And of course, the executive team sit around and say, oh, well, first day on the job and starts in the morning. And she said, no, go backwards. And so we say, it starts with the signing of the contract. And she said, go backwards. And the reality is that your induction program starts the minute the recruitment process starts, because the tone that is set through how that process is handled is part of the cultural setting of the organisation, and it's the way that a new director will view your organisation, view how they're expected to behave, view how they're expected to interact and engage with your organisation. And so those early steps are actually all part of that induction process, and it's really important to get that right. So and that's great messaging for whether it's a director or a member of staff, is that the induction starts with the minute they set foot in the door for the first interview. That's and even before, with the email correspondence. Are you on time? Are you timely? What type of language do you use? How much do you follow up? Like, these things all sit with culture. They all contribute to how the culture of the organisation is. So I want to talk about a number of steps in terms of induction. Now, a lot of organisations will do one of these steps reasonably okay, and that's what I call the functional story of the organisation. So it's going into the business, understanding what makes it tick, what products and services do you deliver, where's your income derived from, understanding your organisational chart, knowing the constitution, understanding the cadence of meeting. It's all the functional stuff. And how often is it that we get an induction pack and it's full of all of this? It's, here's our style guide and here's our media policy and the policies and procedures. That's great. And it's foundational and it absolutely has to happen. But that's not it. That's just one part of what a really, really good induction process should be. So I want to talk through some of the other parts, and they're, unfortunately, I don't think often handled as well. There's a second piece, which is the underlying story, the unwritten story of the organisation. And this is where you talk about, in the organisation's evolution, where is it today? What's made it what it is? What's its background and experience? So there's almost the human story behind the organisation. A couple of years ago, we had, a particularly disastrous business venture, because these incidents that happen in an organisation's past create scarring on the organisation, and they create baggage. And it's important to understand the context of that as a director, not because you're going to relive the past, but because if we don't understand the past, then we can't really know ourselves and therefore know not just the right pathway for the future, but the best tactical way to get there, because you will decide on how you execute strategy very differently depending on some of these stories of the past. You know, how much communication do you need to go into with your members or your stakeholders to instrument a particular change? You know, are they more hands-off? Are they more hands-on? How much are they expecting from you as an organisation? That deep understanding of the organisation kind of DNA, that's a really, really important part of induction. So that's probably best done, you know, quite frankly, over a dinner and maybe a nice glass of red, because it's the storytelling behind the organisation that creates really critical learning pathway that helps new directors not be behind the 8 ball for the first 6 months, kind of feeling like you're at the party, but you missed the main invite. You know, you don't have all of that intricate knowledge. So that's a really great part of the induction process. The other part, of course, is just the relationship part. Boards are really delicate ecosystems. They're a microcosm of the organisation, but they're really delicate ecosystems in their own right. So understanding the key relationships around that's understanding the different working styles, ways of communicating of each of the other directors, knowing the way that the chair best likes to run meetings, the best way to communicate up to the chair, down through the chair, the best way to interact with the staff, getting to know your executive team, getting to know the nuance of how to best. These are the things that allow you to get the best out of your organisation. Now, great people will do this as a matter of course. Great people, when they come into your organisation, will go, who's who in the zoo and how do I get the best out of this place and the relationships within it? Because we run people businesses at the end of the day. It's just a combination of a whole bunch of people doing things. And understanding how those people tick is really important. And then the last piece of induction is understanding what the business is like from the ground up. So this is the going into the Woolies shop. It's the going onto the factory floor. It's the spending time in the hospital. It's the spending time, getting to know the staff, whatever your organisation might look like. And really understanding the nuts and bolts of the business, because it's really easy to set that top line in the boardroom, but you have to understand the nuts and bolts and from the ground up. So all of these elements make up induction. And the more you can do before your first meeting, of course, the more you're going to hit the ground running. Unfortunately, what generally speaking happens is that we do the functional piece before the first meeting and everything else has to happen over the next 6 months. So you're kind of 6 months into the job before you're really able to make, a great contribution to the board, because that induction process has been pretty poor. So look, there are a few of my thoughts on induction. And the last piece, of course, is understanding, particularly if it's a first board position, understanding the dynamic of how to get the best in terms of your own behaviour. So one of the things that we talk about is the extraordinary complementarity, but also the difference between being an executive and being a director. As an executive, you're involved in the doing. And so it's the classic nose as in, fingers out. That's the dilemma. And so we find a lot of executives come to the boardroom and want to apply their skill set as they would as though they're an executive. And of course, we know that that's not what the board is there to do. So it's really important to understand your own behaviours. I talk a lot, as you've probably noticed, and as an executive, I'm energetic and I'm in there and I'm a driver of activity. But one of the first lessons that I had to learn when I started becoming a director was knowing when to shut up. And actually, for me, it was most of the time. So learning how to sit back and be contemplative and all of those things and moderating your behaviour. That's a skill set and it's a learned skill set. So it takes time to perfect, and being aware of yourself, your own behaviours and what you're bringing to the table in terms of that dynamic is actually also a really important part of induction, because it will set you up for success on that board or for a board full of tension for a long time.
Megan, I could not agree with you more. It's absolutely fascinating. In our new version of the skills matrix, we actually do people go through a little process to understand what is their behavioural or leadership style. And there's quite a few boards that are absolutely gobsmacked because they didn't realise, but they've ended up with all of the same style. So one board in particular were all analytics, incredibly high calibre, clever people, but like attracted like, and they're all analytical. And they were saying they can't believe they discovered this because they could never actually make a decision. because you never have enough information. You never have you can never actually get to that point where you're confident to make a decision. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of the most overlooked things is your own behaviour and how that impacts on others.
Absolutely. So I remember taking staff of my previous organisation that I worked for, and I took the staff, one of those staff retreats, and only a very small organisation. And I took them through an exercise where we all did Myers-Briggs and found out, our 4 letters. And it was only a very small staff, and we hit 11 of the 12 quadrants of Myers-Briggs. So we had huge diversity in the organisation, which of course is a massive strength for your organisation. You want that sort of diversity, but they need to understand what that diversity means and understand how to get the best, particularly in communicating across the different styles. So I had analytical people that were trying to communicate with my creative people and not understanding why they weren't getting the best out of them. They were diving straight into the technical detail and not creating the space to make relationships and allow for innovation, creativity and thinking. So it was such a great exercise, and it was like absolutely astounding how very, very small but deliberate behavioural changes, like just changing the tag on an email or saying, hi, hope your day's going great at the beginning before you jump straight into the question. The different communication styles made such a huge difference. That organisation had a lot of analytical people in it. And similarly, we had to get our creatives to cut the fluff down and talk straight to the analytical people. Such a great exercise to do. I would really recommend it across many organisations, particularly when you're talking about executive and board, because executives are naturally our leadership circles in Australia are littered with type A personalities, and then they all end up on the boards. They all end up with this board stacked full of A-type personalities, and you need a little bit of diversity, but you need to understand how to bring the best out of your introverts, for example.
Oh, exactly. Like that is actually, if you think about being a chair, and whether you're a chair of a board subcommittee or the chair of an actual board, that is one of the most important things to know about your directors, because you can accidentally overlook someone who is actually engaged, but they're not expressive in their physical appearance and they're just quietly thinking. I'm a bit like you, Megan. I'm always envious of the person who sits there and waits until everyone else has spoken and then says something really smart and really intuitive.
Yeah.
And always like, I try so hard. In fact,
and the conversation just goes that way. Just from that person. You think, we were actually thinking about the wrong problem for the last 20 minutes.
I know. And I can remember when I was a CEO, very young CEO of hospital, and the chair had a KPI for me, and I actually had to learn to be able to hear myself listen. It was a really good KPI for me. Yeah. I'm not telling anybody how that went, but it was a really good one. It actually meant you had to be quiet. It was very clever, I thought. Yeah. Very clever chair. But look, induction, it's I love boards now. Induction is so much bigger and better, and it's so much more interesting. It is not just that here's your manual, and those tips you've given us are absolutely fabulous. Thank you. Absolutely wonderful. So the next area I'm really interested to talk about, and this is the one that I think for you, with the Governance Institute development, but some of the newer areas of development. But I'm really interested to hear about this from you.
Yeah, look, the life of a director is getting more and more complex. There's absolutely no doubt. We've got ESG issues here, understanding cyber, which of course is very front of mind for boards all around the country now. As I said, keeping them up at night, cyber and human resources issues, because the war for talent is so intense at the moment. These are really the things that are exercising the mind of boards. And it can be a real challenge, because directors, almost by their very nature, have achieved a very high level in life. They're experienced people. They'll often, let's face it, come with egos. And yet the most confident of directors are those that are humble enough to know that they're still always learning. None of us, apparently, what came out of the womb knowing everything. So we continually have to upskill ourselves through life. And the pace of change is just extraordinary at the moment. So what was top of the game knowledge in, for example, the area of climate change 3 years ago is not top of the knowledge today. We need to be continuing to evolve our thinking, particularly around some of these growing and emerging areas of consideration. That also requires us to do two types of continual education. One is inside the business and the other one's outside of the business. So it's really important that, because no business stays the same. Well, if it does stay the same, I would probably suggest it's not a very successful business. Organisations evolve and directors have to continually be thinking about learning what's going on in the business at the moment. So that internal learning piece is important. But I know today we're going to be focusing a little bit on the external learning piece, because not only are there the functional skill sets of, for example, understanding around cyber, everything from insurance, new privacy legislation, tightening up of privacy legislation, which is undoubtedly going to be a topic du jour for 2023, the emerging issues around the S in ESG, which I think is going to be another big frontier. We've heard that ASIC is now bringing, cases against greenwashing, or what happens when we start to see the first cases of social washing, because organisations are wanting to do the right thing and therefore declaring ambitious plans in annual reports, but how close are they actually getting to solving some of these extricable issues? So it's really important that we're updating our skill sets. Now, I want to talk about that specifically as it relates to cyber in particular. It's been a really big topic of conversation of late. And in fact, I just presented at a cyber conference last week. And the question on most directors' lips is, how technical do I need to get? How much do I need to know? Because surely I'm not going to be expected to be the IT manager and, understand everything there is to know about IT. Look, I think that the answer to that question is actually going to be pretty confronting to most people, because the answer is you actually need to know a fair bit. You can't just sit back and say, we're going to bring in an external advisor and we're going to employ a company to do some breach testing for us once a year and rely on their reporting. It's not going to be enough. I think that particularly the Optus and the Medicare scandals of late, I think will bring into stark clarity for directors that they are now going to be expected to have a level of cyber literacy or data literacy or digital literacy in the same way that the Centro case woke the director community up to their level of financial literacy. It is not going to be enough to rely on the one person in the room that has deep tech skills. So yes, it's important that boards start to think about their skill set and bringing on people with increasing technical skills, but every director needs to upskill themselves. And you do that because we all know that our fiduciary duty means that we have to know at the very least enough to be able to do two things: ask the right questions and have a bit of a bullshit radar, excuse my French, but you have to be able to have that radar to know when you're not being fed something that's quite right. That is what keeping your executive to accountability means. And if you don't have that radar and enough knowledge to have that, then you're in trouble as a director. You need to be able to having both those things. So any director that, for example, doesn't know where you are at on the Essential 8, or where you are, what the Essential 8 is in the first place, as opposed to the NIST framework, and where your data is stored and how your data is stored, what the crown jewels of your data is, how you collect the data. These are really important questions directors need to be asking. So you need to know at the very least enough to know, what is an API is, what our security platform looks like, what our attack surface looks like. Most organisations have no idea at the vulnerabilities in their system, and this is what you need to know as a director. So that outside education is really important. The other piece, of course, is that we're not all perfect on day one. And so then there's the other element of, right, I'm a director now. How do I improve my general skill set as a director? Not my deep knowledge in whether it's environmental or social or cyber, but how do I improve my general skill set as a director? And this is where, for example, our Effective Director course, which I know that you're going to give a bit of a plug to later, so the Governance Institute does an Effective Director course, and it really says, we know a lot of our members are deep technical professionals because that's what the Governance Institute does. The Governance Institute gives that theoretical knowledge and expertise around ethics and cyber and all of the things I've just mentioned. But this Essential Director course is, how do you pack all of that together and then use your behavioural skill set, use your understanding of people dynamics, human behavioural dynamics? How do you get the most out of it from that perspective? And that is a really key area, because that's what separates really great directors from those that are just warming the chair.
No, I absolutely. I think you're so right. It's so much about behaviour. It really is, because you can actually not be impactful with your knowledge.
Yes.
So you're absolutely right, Megan. There is some new knowledge. Even if you've got the highest qualifications, traditional qualifications, knowing about cyber and knowing about ESG is new for all of us. But then the next piece, I couldn't agree with you more, is how to be impactful with that. And we're seeing examples all the time of decisions that haven't even been made at a board level that either stakeholders or people within the organisation are bringing up. And of course, and that's proving that the organisation's being hypocritical. It's not actually living by its values or doing what it's told. So I agree with you. Being an effective director and learning to be that is so crucial.
And I might just mention one other area of development, which is so critically important. And I think, once again, most good directors know this a little bit by osmosis, but I think it's worthwhile pointing it out very specifically. And that is continuing to have really broad knowledge. As a director, it's great, for example, to sit across different organisations, sit on a number of different boards, be reading the paper, be attending conferences, be networking with your peers, because once again, all knowledge doesn't reside in any one particular organisation or individual. And having that broad radar and that broad perspective is really important, both internally in your organisation, but really important to have it externally as well. And that's why bringing together a community of people through, whether it's the Governance Institute or major events, it's such an important part of being a director, because you will learn these snippets of knowledge just through your network. And that's a really important part of what you bring to the board as well.
And actually, you're so right. It's that trends and issues and having an insatiable appetite for the high level things that are going on in society around you, so that you're not caught out.
Yeah.
And we've been seeing a lot of really clever ways of doing this, having that insight time on the board, or that strategic insight time. And as you say, apart from bringing in Governance Institute to do, or individuals going and doing their effective governance training, we're also saying, look at the directors around the table. There are some incredibly clever people here, and actually getting them to add to that development program, or executives as well. It is a really clever thing. And getting people, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes, to tell their story. Because the worst thing is, Megan, you're on a board and you turn up, and half the time, until you do some external kind of review process, you don't even know who else is around the table or much about them.
Indeed. Look, I'm a big fan of the informal dinner. Not everything has to be structured. You actually want a bit of time without structure, so that you can make these deep human relationships and connections. Very, very important, both to do alone as a board, but also to do with senior executive, because that's what helps you understand how they tick. So that is really, really crucial. And the other thing that I've seen done, and it's actually been brought to the Governance Institute by our new chair, Pauline Barmos, is dedicating a bit of time on each board agenda for what she calls freeboarding time, which is literally no agenda. It's what's going on in your circle, in your sphere of influence, that you want to raise at this meeting. And it might be that it turns into an action for the organisation. It might not, but it's just that opportunity for directors to exercise what's ticking through their brain in their circle at the moment. So I think that's a really valuable thing to do.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really, really clever. And the other really important thing we've discovered in a director's cycle is this mentorship and the responsibility of directors who've been there and executives who've been around to actually take them under their wing.
Yeah, it's such an incredibly important part of being a director. And look, that might be inside your organisation, it might be outside your organisation, but there'll always be people coming through. And I think assisting the next generation is one of the things I'm really passionate about. So taking on that role, whether it's directly or indirectly, is, I think, quite important. Even something I mentioned here, just as simple as offering to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee before the board meeting. Once again, not structuring it necessarily, because you approach it with an open mind, but just giving someone an opportunity to say, hey, listen, this thing on the agenda, I've got some thoughts about this. But sometimes new directors, they've got great ideas, but they need a bit of validation to be able to really feel confident bringing them to the table, because they might sit back thinking, oh, maybe I'm a bit wrong, and so I won't raise my issue. So you want to be saying, that's a great point, and we should be talking that through. So I think that it really does give that opportunity for incoming directors to feel like they've got a friend. We know one of the most important things for job satisfaction in employees is that they have a bestie at work. And it's no different from around the board table. Knowing that you've got people that are in your corner as a new and emerging director is so critically important to the contribution that you can make. And really, we want those new directors to be making an equal contribution, because they're the ones that don't have the baggage of the past, and they've got fresh ideas, new ideas coming in. So we really want them to be heard. And that's what diversity and inclusion is about. The old adage, diversity is getting invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. We've got to make them feel confident that they know the dance steps.
I love it. I think that's so important. And one of the biggest things I've noticed is that a lot of boards start off, Megan, with this as such an important part of their agenda. Sometimes they'll look at what is the director's skills, and where are some of their skills that they don't have yet, and make sure that they tag them up with a mentor who does have those. But what often makes me sad is that everyone starts off with wanting to do this, and then everyone seems to run out of time. But I would argue that this is one you have to make time for.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. But I'm also a great believer that the impetus for mentorship has to come as much from the mentee as it does the mentor. You have to want it, and you have to be prepared to drive it. I've often said to people who I've mentored in the past, you have to drive this relationship, because, not only am I busy, and that's not to say that you're too busy to do the job, but I want to know the person's really invested in their own development. And so I say to them, you need to take control and step up to this plate. I'm not going to hold your hand and do it all for you. It's probably why my children are very, very independent. But I do think that it's the responsibility of the mentee. And if you are serious about an NED career, then that is something that you'll take that bull by the horns and really invest in your future.
No, I think that's really good. And actually also, Megan, just to add to this, I have seen some directors, and they run this by their chair, but they've actually got mentors who are outside of their organisation.
It's actually critically important to have a combination of both. I've always been a great believer that you should have a mentor internally and you should have a mentor externally, because sometimes you can't talk about some of the things that are exercising your brain internally with someone else who's close to the business. Sometimes you actually want a completely independent view that is blue sky. It's completely blue sky. And so I think that that's really, really important, because they'll bring an entirely different perspective, because they haven't been inducted by the conversations that have happened to date. So I think that's critically important and really valuable.
No, I think so too. I think it's great. So it sounds like we're in fierce agreement that mentorship is really, really important. And this, believe it or not, is just as important a step, retirement, as any other directorship. It's, or, you know, any other part of this director cycle or life cycle. And I know from having chatted to you about these things in the past, I love some of your notions around overboarding and those sorts of things. Explain those a bit more, because they are really helpful ideas.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I'll start with overboarding. One of the really important things to keep in mind is your capacity to continue to perform adequately in the role, of course, and adhere to your fiduciary duties. That means that you have to have enough time to commit to the role. And the role of a director is becoming increasingly complex. You hear great directors that say, this is not a retirement job. If you want a happy retirement, retire, play golf, do something else, because being a director is not a retirement job. It's hard work. You have to invest the time to really deeply understand not only your organisation, but these emerging issues and trends in market. Mm-hmm. So, and there's a huge responsibility on your shoulders. So I think that it's something increasingly that we have to have a conversation about, but we also then have to have it in the context of remuneration for directors and the way that directors put together portfolios of work, because there's no doubt that, you know, I think that I read something from a New Zealand organisation that said some of its directors had up to 15 boards that they were sitting on. Now, that to me feels like a lot. And I think that it's really important. And so why does this come up in the context of a conversation around retirement? Because you've got to know when to retire. And if you want to take up another position, but you know you're going to be stretched thin, then retiring off a board before your natural term is up is absolutely the right thing to do. You have to know when it's the right time for you to go. If your energy, your attention span, your time is diverted to a point where you can't give a full contribution to a board, then that's absolutely the time. And look, that sometimes is really hard to recognize in yourself. It might be a tough conversation that a chair has to have with a director, or even that a director has to have with a chair, because it might be the chair that's the one in the hot seat on this particular one. But it's something that I think is really important. We need to have a broader conversation in Australia around the role of a director, how much responsibility is involved, its remuneration, and therefore how many boards can you reasonably be expected to be on top of.
Megan, I think you're absolutely right. Look, it's absolutely fascinating, because when you think about going onto a board, there are crucial things that happen across the year that you can't be excused from. So right. You really do need to be involved in strategy. You really do need to be involved in CEO review. You need to be involved in your own board review, your own development, then budget, then stakeholder engagement and other things. And also one or two committees.
I was going to say, and then sit on or chair committees, which brings a whole nother level. So if you can't commit the time, and look, I have to say this is once again a really important part of the planning process and the induction process. I have seen way too many times, particularly I have to say in the NFP world, where people are wanting to give back to a board, but they've put their hand up to become a director before they've really understood the commitment involved. Board meetings that are scheduled in the work week, how much time is involved in committee reading, how much time is involved in preparation and planning for meetings. Simple things like looking at the meeting schedule for the next 12 months. If I can't attend 5 out of the 6 meetings because I'm away or doing something else or have other timetabling clashes that can't be reconciled, then, you have to be doing that due diligence and understanding the time commitment involved before you put your hand up for the role.
No, I think that's really important. And it's actually fascinating, just speaking about retirement. A lot of directors, when we ask about retirement in our assessments, say that, 54% of directors don't believe that succession is handled at all well. So apart from yourself, being diligent about your committing, undercommitting or overcommitting, there's also the process that the organisation needs to think about, and that's succession. And it's really interesting, Megan, but rarely when we talk to boards, rarely is it an open discussion around the table. They feel like it's kind of secret squirrel business to talk about the chair succession, those sorts of things. some people don't even know, is the deputy chair going to be the next chair? And this is subcommittees and the board. So is that in your experience as well?
Yes, absolutely. And it's often comes down to things like even, the selection of who's on committees and who chairs committees. It can be, captain's pick on some boards, literally where the chair just says, well, I think this and this and this. And you find out halfway through a board meeting that you're chairing a committee. So,
or you're not, yeah.
Or not. So it's a really important conversation piece that you've brought up. And I think it goes to the heart of when boards become more sophisticated.
Yeah.
So one of the boards that I sit on, for example, have now put in place an entire succession planning piece of governance, which is what happens at what point when. So for this particular board, it's a matter of, say, for example, the board succession planning where we look at all of the tenures of the different directors, and there's a scheduled time so I chair the people and risk committee for this particular organisation, and there is a scheduled time on the annual work plan for that committee to say, right, this is the meeting where we think about succession planning. This is the meeting where we think about the committees for next year. This is the meeting where in between that meeting, the chair of the People Audit and Risk Committee, the People Governance and Risk Committee, which is this particular board, will have one-on-one conversations with anyone who's expressing an interest with regards to wanting to be the chair. They'll have a side conversation with the chair, but there is a process involved and some delicate conversations. And this is where it really is essential that you have the right person chairing either that committee or being the chair of the board, because these are delicate and confidential conversations. And you have to have someone that's not only prepared to have them, but has them in a delicate and considerate manner.
Absolutely. And that that people do feel there's a fair and transparent process.
And the easiest way to do is schedule it in. Schedule it into your work program like you would like you do your audit process. Yeah, audit process happens every year. Well, every year you should be thinking about is, are we fit for right now, but are we fit for the future as a board?
No, I think that's terrific. And so, Megan, is that scheduled on the board agenda or does this committee takes care of that?
On this particular board, that committee takes care of it. Actually, I sit on a couple of different boards, and in both boards, succession is part of the committee work, but it can be handled by the whole board if you don't have a big committee structure. It can be handled. It doesn't matter where it's handled, just schedule it in. Yeah, because scheduling it in takes the tension out of having the conversation. You're having the conversation because it's on the work plan.
Exactly. No, I think that's really good. And in fact, we've actually, as we've been talking, a couple of people have been asking questions. So it might be a good time to start bringing in a couple of those questions because, in fact, more questions are going up. Someone's interested. Peter is actually really interested in your thoughts. Recruitment from outside the facility geographical area, attendance via Zoom meeting. This is a big subject at the moment about, these are the skills, but getting them from outside of your area. Love your thoughts on that. And then I've got another couple of questions after that.
Yes. So there's sort of two questions there. The first is the recruitment piece, and the second is what are my thoughts about Zoom meetings, and I'll get to that in a moment.
Right.
So the first bit about the recruitment from outside the facility geographic area, absolutely critical, but it's just one part of the diversity piece that I was talking about before. So without understanding what your geographical area looks like, it might be that, it might be outside the town, outside the state, outside the country even, and that might be really important. So, for example, if you're running a big power utility, having someone that's got experience in power utilities in a different state might be extraordinarily valuable to have that experience and expertise and a bit more of a well-rounded perspective. So definitely think that that's one of the elements. And that's why diversity and inclusion, there's no, Governance Institute of Australia doesn't put out, what's the D&I checklist, because you can't, because it's deeply contextually based. And that's why I say it's got to be driven by the context of your organisation, but also driven by your strategy. Are you thinking about expanding into another area? Well, then maybe get a director on that's got experience in that new area rather than the one you're coming from. So that's sort of my view on that recruitment piece. With regards to Zoom meetings, I think this is a really interesting, it's a really interesting topic that I'm seeing happen across boards, because of course, in COVID, we all went to Zoom meetings, and from my understanding, the world didn't collapse because we were running all of our meetings by Zoom, but there was also no doubt that a lot of boards were missing that human interaction, personal experience, and just the time that sits around the outside of meetings, the 5 minutes getting coffee beforehand, the 5 minutes having dinner at the end, drink or whatever. So I think the thing for me is that there's a balance to be struck. I don't want to lose some of the benefits that we had during COVID of running really efficient meetings by Zoom. So I think, for example, there's some things around committee meetings that are not likely to go for more than 2 hours. There's no reason that you can't run those via Zoom. Board meetings, not every board meeting needs to be face-to-face. You might want to balance some face-to-face, maybe half on Zoom. But you also need to think about sitting on a Zoom for 8 hours is excruciating. Yeah. So think about how you chunk up your annual work plan, but do it in a conscious way, because we don't want to lose the benefits of of minimizing that tyranny of distance through using platforms like Zoom and Teams. They're really fantastic. They minimize time away from the office. They make us more family friendly. How many hours have we sat away from our families, our children, our loved ones, sitting in airports? That is not good use of anyone's time. Limiting our environmental footprint through getting on flights all the time, which is a key consideration for a lot of organisations, particularly services organisations, where it's one of the very few levers that you in fact have, is that your travel contributes to your environmental footprint. So these are all considerations, but it needs to be a deliberate and holistic decision-making process. Don't let it be ad hoc. Have a consistent and considered conversation about it. Say, what is right for us? How do we structure it so that we're not necessarily all face-to-face, but we're not all. And the last thing I'll say about that is hybrid meetings are hard, because you end up having kind of 2 meetings. So when I say a hybrid meeting, some on Zoom, some in the room, they are hard. I would prefer personally to have all one or all other, because I think that everyone has a consistent meeting experience. It can be very difficult if you're the person on the Zoom to hear the little side conversations in the room. That's really difficult. Chairs need to be really aware of how to chair those sorts of meetings to get the best out of them.
No, 100% agree. And look, there's a great little question from Cindy, just to go back to your wonderful points about retirement. She was just wondering, should that meeting that you talked about, talking about everyone's tenure and everything, actually be in an in-camera process? Because it, as you say, it is quite sensitive.
It can be quite sensitive. And so generally speaking, I'd say often it will be an in-camera session, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So I'll give you, once again, it's contextually bound. I'll give you an example. You have a board where a natural tenure is coming up at the end of a term. Well, we all know that directors needs to go because the end of the tenure is coming. The executive team know that. And talking about, well, what is the strategy? I think having an executive in the room for at least part of that conversation could be incredibly useful. So I think that it does depend on the context of how the director position is coming up. But sometimes, definitely, I understand why the question's being asked, and certainly some of those conversations not only held in camera, but often held in piecemeal, just with certain groups of directors and bilaterally with directors rather than collectively, because people don't want to raise, say, for example, an issue with a director where they might want a director to move off the board. They don't want to raise that in an open and general forum. They'll want to raise that in a bilateral conversation.
No, that makes sense. So that's good common sense. The next, we've got another couple of questions, so I'll just be quick. How do, and this already came up earlier as in questions as well, how do not-for-profit organisations who actually don't pay directors attract new directors? When you talk about that recruitment, that director cycle, any little tips that we can do to actually get them on board and to take them through that cycle really well?
Yeah, that's it. Look, it's such a great question. And of course, it's been a perennial topic of conversation around, do you pay directors? Do you not pay directors? How do you get the best out of volunteer directors?
In fact, you and I have had a debate about this.
We have had exactly.
I can't stand it. You won.
And I won on the side of that you don't need to be paid.
Yeah, I can't believe that. We're a pair of old hypocrites. But anyway.
In my experience, finding passionate people to go on NFP boards is actually not the problem. The problem can sometimes be beating them off, because having passion can be a great advantage, but if there's too much of it, can actually be a bit of a disadvantage to being an effective director. So how many sporting teams do we know that the director really wants to be the coach because they're so passionate about what's going on in the team? And so it can get in the way of that fingers out, noses in approach. And so you need to make sure that you're recruiting the right skill set for being a director. But in my experience, there's actually no shortage of people that want to give back, particularly people that are embarking on an NED career and see a great not-for-profit board as a training ground. So you've got some extremely competent executives that want a little bit of board experience that can bring huge contribution to your NFP board. You just need to, once again, have a broad network to know how to find them and how to reach into the community. And it might be that you pay a little bit for the recruitment process, even though you don't pay the director. Let me tell you, to really reach into the right skill set to bring to your board, it'll be invaluable. But actually, in my experience, there's no shortage of people that are willing to volunteer their time, because it's really fulfilling. They're often really passionate about the cause, particularly for a thing like a charity or professional association like the Governance Institute. We just had election directors. We had 2 positions opened up, and we had 5 nominees for the 2 positions across 2 states. So there's no shortage of people that are really passionate and willing to give back. I would say, the organisation side, it's more important, therefore, to do your planning, do your recruitment well, so that you're getting that right skill set.
I think you're right, Megan. I think a professional process, if possible, actually attracts people. As soon as they think, wow, you're professional, you're doing this well, people are attracted.
Well, it sets the tone, which goes to the point that I was making earlier around induction.
And look, another really interesting question, and this is from Bernie Kelly, and this is about acknowledging the scarring that occurs within leadership and the wider organisation by previous challenges or poorly led transformation. Your thoughts on your thoughts on this as clear on risk register, particularly if cumulative across periods. So really what this is about your thoughts on how do we support that at the board?
Indeed. And I think that's really important to acknowledge the difference between sharing the knowledge of things that have occurred in the past that have been either success points or pain points of the organisation that have shaped decision making, because that helps to create the context around why decisions have been made in the past and why things are a certain way they are, but not baggage, not living in the past. Yeah. So the one thing that we don't want is that we are always harking back to the way, a certain thing was done 20 years ago. Like, time moves on, so we need to move with it. But it is important to understand those things. I think where the question is getting to is how do you, particularly because the question's around the previous challenges, poorly led transformations. What can tend to happen in organisations is that there is knee-jerk reactions to pain points. So, and the old cracking a walnut with a sledgehammer comes to mind. We had one little issue, and oftentimes, and I have to say, coming from a governance professional's point of view, how often is it that we've seen a problem in a business occur, and instead of fixing the problem, we fix the problem with a process? And so then you have this layer of process upon another layer of process upon another layer of process, a lot of which just hinders your organisation. And then we see it as regulatory red tape, but we've created it for ourselves because we haven't wanted to just deal with the heart of the problem instead of creating a process around it somehow. So, but those, and understanding why those processes in place is really important, because a brave director will go, I don't think we need that process anymore. I think that, for example, some procedure that some division of an organisation had to adhere to in terms of the way that they went around a certain thing, I don't think that we need that anymore. So really great organisations can be hallmarked by as much transformational evolving that they do in the future in terms of recognising the current landscape and how they fit for purpose in the future, as well as understanding why things happened the way that they did in the past, and being conscious to not repeat those mistakes, but also being conscious to not live in the past and keep all those processes because they might not be needed anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. So some fabulous questions, some absolutely fabulous questions. And what I'd like to do before we finish today is I really want to talk about some of the things that you've got, that the Governance Institute's got, that can actually in this director cycle. And I know it helps from our partnership. And when directors go through the review and development, either as a board or as individuals, and then they can tap into these courses, it really does change their capabilities and builds their engagement and, ability to be a better director. So talk to us about a couple of these courses, because the Effective Director course in particular is probably one of my favourites.
Yes. Look, it's a great program, and it really came about as a need of, we understand that a lot of directors, particularly people that are involved in the Governance Institute and involved in the governance community, there'll often be a reasonably good base level of skills across areas like finance and law and all the rest of the, regulatory and risk components that go into knowing what you're doing as a director. So the theoretical knowledge is often there, albeit that the basics of it are covered in this course, but covered at a little bit more of an advanced stage. But the real benefit of this course is really understanding those behavioural dynamic pieces. It's understanding how the conduct of meeting flows, how to read the room, understanding the different learning styles of directors. So as an executive, I know on my board, for example, who wants to read the document a week in advance and who's better off to have the conversation in the flesh in the room. Some people want the pre-thought. Some people work best in the moment. So you might send it to them a week out and they'll say, I haven't got time to read this until the day of the meeting. So, that's the way that they work in the moment. There's all sorts of those differences. So really the Effective Director course is about taking that skill set to the next level, about really understanding how boards are put together and also how to build your own board career as well, which is part of it. And then the Women Exclusive course was something that we put on recognising that women still make up the minority, and there's a lot of boards that have still no women on them. But oftentimes on boards, the woman will still be, the very much the minority. You might be the only woman on the board, or you might be one of only two. And we know that we need 30% of critical mass to really change the dynamic in the room. So one of the things that we all need to understand is the unconscious biases that happen that flavour conversations. And that's the unconscious bias that happens from for example, from men, but it's also it's not happens from men. It's the unconscious bias that we have about other people. And then it's the unconscious bias that we have about ourselves. And both of those things can take on a gendered lens. I have to say, my favourite study about unconscious bias is actually a study that was conducted by the University of Massachusetts a number of years ago, which looked at the correlation between executive leadership and height. Now, we know that someone's bone density and bone structure has nothing to do with their intelligence nor capability to run an organisation. And yet, all of us, it seems, have an unconscious bias towards taller people, associating them with leadership qualities. Now, that's got nothing to do with gender, albeit that men tend to be taller than women. So that is what unconscious bias really is about. It's about those little insidious biases that we have. So what the Women Only course does is it allows a group of women to unpack what some of that might look like in the boardroom and how to handle it in the moment. And it also talks about the unconscious bias that we have about ourselves, because that same perception that we have of the outside world, we have a perception of ourselves. We all have imposter syndrome. It tends to sit worse with women than it does with men, who tend to have a more confident, perception of their capability than women do. So both of those things, I think it's really important to have the cognitive understanding of what's going on, and then a few tools in your kit bag to know how to deal with it.
Well, Megan, I just have to say congratulations, because these courses are they're so, what we like to say, on. They're just absolutely perfect, because with all of our assessments, particularly around the director's own capabilities, and when we look at their contemporary skills and their behavioural styles, these courses really are helpful, because, as you say, I think a lot of people have come along the journey of their professional skills are pretty good, but these are the next ones that make you just that higher functioning board. It's just so after this, we're actually everyone who has registered is going to get a copy of this, the link to this webinar, and they'll of course get copies to these links. I think they're going to be terrific.
Yeah,
really
and
helpful.
We're seeing a huge demand for these courses. So, they're reasonably priced. They are, they're in depth. They're backed by the huge rigor of educational expertise of the Governance Institute of Australia. The Governance Institute of Australia is both internationally and tertiary regulated in Australia. So our depth of knowledge and the robust and rigorous nature of our course materials is very much validated through the feedback that we're getting from these courses. It's just been phenomenal.
I think they're absolutely perfect. They really are perfect for that for 2023, directors having these skills. It's going to go a very long way. It's going to be fantastic. So, Megan, I cannot thank you enough. I've taken a huge lot of notes myself today, and I'm sure everyone who's come has just learnt so much. And just thank you so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom. And it's, as always, it's been just fantastic to catch up with you.
Always an absolute delight to talk to you, Fee, anytime.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's been a fabulous session, and we look forward to getting a copy of this out to you, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.